Good morning, colleagues, and welcome to our next sort of session with the Mail and Guardian. And in this session, we are looking at discussing youth participation in policy and development under the sub-theme of encouraging electoral participation and economic engagement, specifically for the youth demographic. We are very excited to have you with us once more, and we have a very capable panel, as you would have noticed when you did RSVP, that I hope that we'll have an enriching discussion, particularly keeping in mind that we have Youth Month that's coming up in June, but also to just also understand that youth itself and the way in which we treat youth issues should be at the core of it, quite cross-cutting, as it were. So it's important that when we discuss youth issues, that we don't just keep it for Youth Month. When you discuss women's issues, we don't just keep it for August, for instance. And so this is essentially the spirit with which we want to try and engage on this platform. Of course, you'll find the chat box that's available for you to engage with. And I'll be reminding you at different points in time in relation to this. We'll also have a couple of poll questions that we'd like you to participate in as well. Of course, we are hosting this in collaboration with the Mail and Guardian, one of South Africa's leading publications and media houses, as it were. Just to set the context, I'll go back to our sort of core concept that we established today's engagement with before introducing the speakers to you. Of course, our speakers, as I said, they are very accomplished, so I hope they forgive me for not reading their entire bios because, I think we might be here for the entire 2 hours just talking about their experience. But of course, let me go to the context first. So as we thought about putting together this conversation, we noted the following sort of things. The South African youth, in terms of the 15 to 34 demographic, currently consists of about 35.1% of the population, which makes it the largest demographic in the country. The absence of key government programming aimed at amplifying youth potential towards contributing to the country's socio-political development continues to be a worrying trend. The effect of youth wings in the more established political parties also seems to have what is somewhat the opposite effect that it might be intended to. And the effect that it has, that it actually sidelines youth political participation. Youth political participation is generally at the periphery of what the main sort of mainstream agenda of that political party ought to be. Thus, we see that young people are not necessarily seen as part of the mainstream agenda of those political parties. Statistics also speak rather to youth voter turnout in elections continue to indicate a worrying trend, particularly when coupled with data on unemployment and access to tertiary education. The bulk of youth activism that we've seen in our country occurs outside of the more institutionalized processes of government. This is evident in the formation of campaigns and movements targeted at reform of institutional policies and processes. And we saw this as far back as the Fordist movements, for instance, roads must fall, fees must fall, and so forth. So as we engage on this specific conversation, we've brought along key stakeholders from Tesoro, Youth Capital, and Youth Lab to try and understand and unpack the following issues. What are the sort of institutional frameworks that are available for youth participation in South Africa? What are the policies that are available for youth issues, and how responsive are they to the needs of young people? We also wanted to talk about what is the role then of civil society, specifically NGOs, in engaging with some of these issues that we find in the youth space. Of course, then we also talked about what is the nature of access to employment and other income generating activities for young people. And of course, all of this will be around the broader theme of discussing challenges, opportunities for reform, and potentially not even reform, sort of bringing down certain policies to the extent where we start from the ground up in relation to policy, voting, and work for young people. Our speakers for today are Ms. Tessa Dooms. Tessa Dooms is the director of Tesoro Consulting, a development consultancy that provides organizations with services on policy, programming, and organizational strategies towards the development of Africa. Tesoro provides policy analysis, program development, facilitation and training, and development communication services across sectors nationally and internationally. Tessa herself has 15 years experience as a development worker, trainer, and researcher with expertise in governance and youth development and innovation. We'd like to welcome Tessa. And then our second speaker for today will be Ms. Pearl Pillay. Ms. Pearl Pillay is an activist and youth development practitioner that's based in Johannesburg. She's currently the managing director of Youth Lab, a national youth think tank that aims to mainstream youth participation in community development and policy making. She holds a master's degree in political studies from the University of the Witwatersrand, and she's currently working at securing her PhD in sociology at the University of Cape Town. Then our final speaker will be Ms. Crystal. It's Mrs. probably because of the hyphenated surname, but I don't know. We'll find out a bit later in case anyone's intrigued by that. Ms. Crystal Duncan Williams. Crystal has over 10 years of research experience across the fields of molecular biology, public health, and youth employment. She has an undergraduate degree in molecular and cell biology and a master's in public health in health economics. She's currently the project lead for Youth Capital, which is an advocacy and mobilization campaign focused on ensuring that young people in South Africa have the skills and opportunities to get their first decent job. She also serves on the board of the Center for Social Development in Africa, based at the University of Johannesburg. And I will be welcoming all three speakers and hope that I haven't butchered anything on your profiles. But of course, for the purposes of the engagement, we will be switching off our cameras when we are not speaking, so that we can be able to allow the person who will be the focus of that point of the discussion to be the actual focus. And on behalf of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, who is our chief donor at the Democracy Development Program, the maiden guardian, as well as the executive director of the organization, Dr. Paul Kariuki, I'd like to welcome all of you and look forward to seeing your comments and engaging on the platform itself. Let me hand over to Tessa to set us up just in terms of her brief presentation. Each speaker is allocated 10 to 15 minutes to just give us an initial outline of their thoughts. And Tessa will be speaking about the broad policy objectives for youth participation that are available in the country, the political dynamics affecting the youth voice, and the sorts of shifts that she deems necessary to encourage young people's participation in the space. And yeah, of course, any other important details that she might have. Yeah.
I need to unmute myself.
Yes, thank you.
Clearly. So as I said, my name is Tessa Dooms, and really my focus is around youth development, but also the development of Africa, which I think is integrally linked to youth development. As we know very well, the statistics show that Africa and South Africa as a subsection of that has a large youth population. And as such, all African issues, all issues on the continent are youth issues. When the majority of your population is under the age of 35, more than 60% of the population, you cannot separate out any development issues from youth issues. And so it's in that context that I think these conversations are particularly important. I think for a long time, youth development has been seen as this kind of the sideshow of the development world and the sideshow of the political world. And we haven't mainstreamed it sufficiently. And in fact, there's a lot of issues that I have with the idea of mainstreaming youth participation, given the demographic dividend, given the demographics of the continent and what young people have to contribute to the continent. When we think about things like mainstreaming, we're assuming that the status quo is one where young people are not central, and that somehow we need to constantly be fighting for young people to be at the center of things, young people's issues to be reflected. But really, there needs to be a change in perspective when it comes to that, and we need to start thinking about, again, all issues are youth issues. So why do I say that? Because, of course, we know that youth is a transitionary moment in anyone's development. You're not youth all of your life. So there are people who are women or men all of their lives, but nobody is youth their whole life, unless you're in the ANC Youth League, and then things become a little bit interesting. But for the most part, we're in a situation where you have this transitionary phase called youth. But the truth is, while people are youth, if we take the age group 15 to 35, as the African Youth Charter gives us, that age group encompasses people who are students, who are still at high school, and people who are in tertiary education, people who are employed, people who are parents, people who are economic actors and contributors as entrepreneurs, people who are leaders in their community, people who are politicians and elected officials. Young people can be a wide variety of things and are a wide variety of things in our societies. And so given the amount of young people that we have on the continent and the many roles that young people have to take up as they enter into adulthood, we really need to rethink the idea of needing to mainstream young people and focus on the idea that our entire society is youthful, and therefore young people's voices and young people's experiences matter. That being said, the second thing I wanted to just raise is linked to that, the idea of young people as experts. And I know that a lot of the way we think about young people and youth participation is we think about young people as beneficiaries of some kind of programming that government and other entities need to engage in. So we say, we need to get more young people to come into spaces so that we can give them programs, do interventions. So there's a pathologizing of youth, an idea that youth is a time of difficulty. And I think of youth not as a time of difficulty, but a time of transition and a time of some vulnerability, but also a time of great potential. And so when we focus on pathologizing youth and thinking about youth as people who need something from the system, we are neglecting what young people can offer to the system. And there are a few things that are important that young people can offer to the system. The first is representation. Especially when you think about political spaces, economic spaces, young people offer, and when they enter into those spaces, they are representative of the majority, and they are representative of a particular set of experiences. Every generation is different. Every generation of young people is different, and they're having a different experience. And so young people bring an expertise about their generation and their generational experience that needs to be taken into consideration, that needs to be accounted for. And in fact, what we're seeing over the last 10 to 15 years, especially in the information age, especially in the age of technology, as globalization is making the world smaller and smaller, the experiences of young people, what we think of a generational gap is actually shrinking. So we used to think of a generational gap maybe as like every 10 years or 15 years of people have different experiences. At this point, if you were 15 5 years ago, you're probably, the 15-year-olds today are probably having a vastly different experience of being 15 than you did. If you were 25 3 years ago, 25-year-olds today are living in a dramatically different world. And if you think about something like COVID and how that's disrupted life, 25-year-olds today are living in a dramatically different set of circumstances than you did as a 25-year-old. And so we're seeing that we need to take seriously that even though older people have experienced youth at some point, we all know the anecdotes of our parents telling us, oh yeah, I was young once too. The truth is your young and my young are two very different youngs. And we need to take into consideration what the current youth experience is and treat young people as the experts on their experience, the experts on what it means to be youth, what it means to be at different ages, different cohorts, and having different experiences, rather than assuming that because we experienced youth, we know and understand the youth experience. And that helps us with another thing that is important, is we need to be able to be agile about the way we think about youth development. And young people need different things at different points of their development, but they also need different things based on different contexts that they are in. And so as contexts shift, young people need spaces to express those experiences, express their context, give us an understanding and an insight into their aspirations, what it is they want, so that as we design policy, as we design the social architecture of our society, as we design governments, we're designing it with young people in mind. And I would go as far as to say that we even need to start talking to children more, and starting to think about how children are experiencing the world, so that we can start building worlds that are inclusive and building worlds that are dynamic and agile. We're seeing that people's experiences are changing, but we're staying in the same systems that we were using 20, 30 years ago. One example of that is the way we think about democracy, and I'm sure my other colleagues will speak about that a little bit more. But we've used the same system of democracy for so long, but the way in which people are living their lives are different. And so when we see something like youth apathy around politics, maybe it's not that youth are apathetic, but maybe it's the systems that we have in place are not actually responding to young people because we're not listening to them. We're not listening to what they want. We're not listening to what it is that they think that the system should bring. And we're not harnessing their unique capabilities and experiences and knowledge as something that we can use to build the system, as opposed to see young people as something that needs to be built. So why do we need to do this, and what do we need to start doing to change youth participation and make youth participation something that is not only meaningful, but something that is everyday, that is part of the way we live our lives as society? I think the first thing we need to do is make space for youth. I think that we've gotten into a habit and into a cultural position as a society where we've told young people they need to fight for space. They need to bang the door down if they want a seat at the table of policy, that they need to fight for their voices to be heard. And that's partly because of our history as a country, as a continent, and as African and Black societies, where we come from a history of having to fight for space. And I think we are in a moment historically where we really need to say, we shouldn't have young people have to fight for space. If we recognize that young people have something of value to offer, we should be offering them spaces at the table and making space for them, and realizing that we as older generations of people, we as society, we as the status quo, don't necessarily know and understand what is best for young people, and so they shouldn't have to fight down the door. We should see the value in their participation. But also, we need to support young people and provide young people with resources and networks and the kinds of things that experience in time allows for. So many young people come in with great ideas, with great innovation, with ways that they would like to engage with the world, but the thing that they lack is the resource or the networks in order to do that. And that's what society needs to offer young people before we offer them some kind of paternalistic support that we come up with as a society. We actually need to be saying to young people, what resources do you need in order to be a contributing member of the society, in order for the ideas that you have to actually land? And I think once we start doing that, once we start saying, we're not going to make young people fight for space, we're going to enable them not just with interventions that we want, but with resources and things that we can put into their hands so that they can use their own agency to grow and to develop and to contribute. I think we'll have a better society overall, and we'll see that young people will take on a different space. They'll take on a different, youth will take on a different meaning. Youth should not be a time of perpetual just anguish and pain and struggle. It has to be a time of growth and contribution, and we must enable that as much as we possibly can. I think the final thought that I'll share before we go is the idea of young people as having skin in the game, and why that space is so important. So we were busy with a project with Jasoro and an organization called SAYA, where we were looking at the APRM and making a contribution to South Africa's next African peer review submission. And the one thing that struck me about that process was that if you ask young people about what's currently happening, they clearly have a set of experiences based on the now and on today. But young people also have a long-term view that's really important, because they are seeing themselves into the future with greater certainty than anybody else is. Part of the reason why having older leaders in power is because their skin in the game is limited by their age. Their skin in the game is limited by what it is that they need to do, because they've already accomplished so much. Young people have skin in the game that's very long term, because they're not only thinking about their own development. Young people are thinking about the next generation that they need to serve. Young people are thinking about the kinds of economies of the future. Young people are thinking about the obstacles that they may face in 20, 30, 40 years' time. And so it was a really important lesson to think about how young people engage with policies, different from the way older people engage with policy, because young people have more to lose if things go wrong. And so it's important that we give young people that space, because they have more to lose. And the space must not be one that is for youth only. And this is the final point I'll make, is that young people aren't only leaders and contributors in youth spaces. Young people need to be leaders and contributors in society. So youth development should not be something that is done amongst young people by themselves. It's not, let's create spaces for young people that are out there. We must be ready for young people to not only lead themselves, but to be led by youth. And I say this every time I speak in youth platforms. People will hear this and say, I've heard this before from Tessa, but I'm going to say it because I believe it needs to stick in our society. I'm now 37. I'm no longer youth. I work in youth development to support young people, but I'm no longer youth. Ultimately, one of my great goals as a citizen, not even just as a youth worker, as a citizen, is to ready myself to be led by young people. We need our society led by young people, as opposed to say that young people need to lead themselves. And so things like youth wings and youth leagues and youth forums and youth parliament, for me, those are not the best ways for us to engage with youth development. We actually have to engage young people as leaders of society, not just leaders of themselves. And I think that will shift a lot of the ways we do policy, a lot of the ways that we do economic development, and a lot of the ways in which we do societal development, and the changing nature of our society will be improved by the way we engage youth more meaningfully. So I think I'll leave it there for now, Brian, and then take questions.
Thank you so much, Tessa, for your input. And Tessa makes a very significant point of trying to problematize the idea of mainstreaming youth participation, which is something that I've also been quite interested in doing, particularly because of how when we speak about youth participation, it's always they must go work on their own, as though you're pushing young people to a corner to go play by themselves, and not necessarily actively engaging them in the main stage, as it were. But yeah, Tessa, for now, we'll allow the other two speakers to come on board, and then at the end of their presentations, we'll take Q&As for everyone that we can engage, because some of the issues will be cross-cutting, I hope. Our next speaker, Ms. Pearl Play, Director of the Youth Lab, which is an organization that's based in Johannesburg, a think tank, will be giving us a brief reflection on youth political participation, understanding the implications, for instance, of the fallist movements on youth social consciousness, and giving a partial analysis of civil society's role in encouraging or in engaging with youth participation in that instance, of course, alongside other issues that she may feel necessary to engage with. Pearl, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you to DDP and the Mail and Guardian for having me on this panel. I'm gonna get into it because I generally run out of time, and I'm not trying to do that today. So I want to start with the reflection on youth political participation. And I think one of the first questions that we need to be asking and trying to figure out collectively is, what do we actually mean when we say youth political participation? Because I think a lot of the conversation, at least in my experience at Youth Lab, talking about youth engagement and youth participation broadly, is that we generally think about political participation as elections, right? So let's go with that for a little bit and talk about youth participation in elections and electoral processes. Our previous election, which was in 2019, saw us have the lowest voter turnout since 1994. And that's not just in the youth demographic, that's across the board. We had a higher number of people who are registered to vote, but we had an 11% drop in our voter turnout. And I know we often don't talk about what voter turnout means for our elections. We don't interrogate the numbers in a way that I think is very meaningful. But I think that our voter turnout numbers and our general attitude towards, especially the last election, tells us a lot about what participation looks like and how people are redefining what participation means for them. And so a lot of the conversations that we had during that election and post that election has been around whether or not young people particularly co-sign and opt into this idea of democracy that we have. And the easy thing to say is, well, young people are not coming out to vote. They're not particularly interested in party politics, super apathetic. And so their political participation is obviously very low. Now, my argument is that, number one, not only is that untrue, but it's a little bit lazy, right? And so the one point that I want to make, particularly around elections and voter turnout, is this idea that just because people don't actively participate in a system the way we think participation should be, doesn't mean they're not actively engaged. A lot of the conversations we had around elections specifically gave us the idea and the insights that it gave us was that young people are very interested in politics, very interested in where the country is going, who gets to lead it, who makes the decisions, who's affected by the decisions, and how as young people we see ourselves in that broader system. However, when you look at the ways in which young people are treated in the political system, so the idea of actually not being able to find young candidates, the way young people are treated within political parties, the way young people are treated in parliament, right? Even the ones that do make it in. There's the sense that there is a contestation between the older generation who hold spaces of power and authority and young people. And there is a bizarre kind of fear that, if you let too many young people in, they're just going to take over. And you know how radical and wild young people are. But also the refusal to let go of power. And so that creates a relationship with each other. And I'm talking generationally here, but just a relationship generally with government and with political power that is hostile and that doesn't foster cooperation. And so what then tends to happen is young people are saying, listen, if you guys are not going to give us an opportunity to participate effectively in the system, we're going to opt out. And that in itself, for me, is youth political participation. Making an active decision to say, actually, I'm not going to vote is political participation. And it might not look the way we want it to look, but I think we need to be able to value and interrogate what young people are saying when they don't show up to the polls in a country in which elections and the right to vote is something that is so important and so etched in our collective memory because we know what had to happen for everyone to get that opportunity. The second thing that I want to say about political participation is that it also happens outside of political parties. It happens outside of the election space, right? We often say the personal is political, the political is personal. And so my argument around this is that young people are participating in politics every single day. And it might sit outside the mainstream. So you're not seeing young people in mass joining political parties. You're not seeing lots and lots of young people saying, I want to contest elections. That's shifting a little bit now with the move towards independent candidates. But young people are finding alternative spaces in which to participate politically. And what that means, which then takes me into the next part of the conversation around the impact of Flawless movements and other student movements or young person movements on social consciousness, is that young people have always been socially conscious, right? And we really enjoy this narrative that young people don't care, everyone's apathetic, we're just interested in our cell phones and groove. But that's wholly untrue. And I think we all know it, But it's an easier narrative to push that young people are just not interested, because saying that means that we don't have to actually work to create space for young people in our development, in our politics, in the way our society is run. And so when we think about things like the Fallers movement, and I'll talk about Fees Must Fall specifically because it's kind of the most recent mass movement that we had. What Fees Must Fall did was say to young people, there is a way and a space for you to organize and participate actively, to talk about issues that you're concerned about, to take on power, to demand accountability. Let's see what you do with it. And at the point where every single university in this country was shut down, I think all conversations around apathy, around lack of participation should have ended. And the conversation that should have started was, what is the reaction of authority and power towards young people who decide to participate in their own way? One of the things that characterized Fees Must Fall for me, specifically that day at the union buildings, was the amount of sheer violence that the state was willing to mete out to young people. And so there's a very weird kind of paradox that exists here, right? Because we're saying young people must participate, they mustn't be apathetic, they must come out, they must do things, they must be revolutionaries, and they must, lead themselves and do all of that stuff. Young people must organize, must be like the 76th generation. And now that we're in June, or we're approaching June and Youth Day, those conversations are going to follow us everywhere. And then when young people do exactly that, they're shot at, they're expelled, they're beaten up, all manner of violence. And so the question for me is less about how young people are participating and what these movements mean for young people, and more about what does it mean for an older generation who understands protest and understands participation in a very, very real way, because they were the ones doing the things, and now treats it as a threat rather than an opportunity to foster a greater political culture. And it's an important question, because I think as we approach elections this year, as we see lots of other youth-related processes happening, so we just wrapped up last year the new version of the National Youth Policy. We're currently doing the new NYDA board. As we go into processes that require young people to put their hands up and say, we want to be a part of this thing, we want to work together to get things done, how do we balance that need for participation and that need for young people to engage meaningfully with democracy? How do we balance that with the way we treat young people when they do? And for me, there is the greater that contestation becomes, the greater you find, police brutality. We saw it a few weeks ago at Wits University, where people were being killed on the streets just going to the doctor because they happened to be in the same place that a protest happened, right? When you continue to do that and you continue to brutalize young people and then say to them, but then participate, how do we expect that thing is going to find each other, right? Because you're asking for two completely opposite things. And what we're finding at Youth Lab and the work that we've been doing over the last few years is that young people are less inclined to participating in the sort of mainstream political space, because the idea is, actually, if I don't like something and I protest, I'm going to get shot. I did a podcast recording with the SABC a few days ago, and one of the questions I was asked, or one of the statements that was made was, yeah, but we have all of these big problems. We've got corruption and safety issues and health issues and all of that, and young people are just not protesting. They're just not doing anything, because they don't care. And my argument was, it's not that people don't care, but I personally am not going to find myself at a protest or at any kind of social movement that requires me to be out on the streets, because the truth of the matter is that we have a police that is so brutal that you will die and no one will care, right? People will care for a little bit, but then it's over, because it's such a regular occurrence and we've normalized brutality and violence against young people to such an extent that we can talk about it in a very flippant way, even though it's a very real, dangerous thing that's happening. And so for me, the conversation around participation has to shift from how do young people participate, what does participation mean, and all of that needs to shift to what do we do with that participation? And what do we do when young people participate in ways that we don't understand, that we don't particularly agree with, that we don't like? What do we do with that? Because the way we do things right now says to young people, actually, nothing you do is going to be valued unless you just kind of opt into the system and do the same things that everyone else is doing, and you keep it moving, right? The last thing that I'm going to talk about, because I only have like 4 minutes left, is civil society's role in youth participation. And this is a really interesting thing. We've been doing this a lot with Youth Lab over the years around what does meaningful youth engagement look like? And for us, what we see broadly, and it's not just a South African issue, it's a global issue, that people don't give thought into what participation means and what meaningful participation looks like. And so we'd often say we're doing a policy conference and we've invited 100 people and 30 of those people are youth. Wonderful, look at us, youth representation, youth participation. But all we're doing is saying to people, put your bum on a seat. And that's the extent of your participation. And as civil society, I think we have a big responsibility to redefine the rules of engagement as far as participation is concerned. Young people, Tessa said this in her bit earlier, young people are experts, right? Young people understand young people best. There's nobody else that can claim to be a youth expert more than young people can. And we have to be able to value that expertise and find ways to use it to make things better. And that means creating a culture of collaboration, of actual genuine engagement, right? When you speak to young people, when you interact with them, when you bring them into work that you're doing as civil society, young people are not supposed to just be beneficiaries of the programs that you create. They're supposed to be partners. They're supposed to be co-creators. There's supposed to be a sense of ownership with the work that you're doing. I'm going to toot our own horn for a little bit, but I think one of the things Youth Hub has done really well over the years is give young people a sense that the work that you do in your communities are valid, they're important, they make sense, and you don't need to be told what it is that you need to be doing because you already know. What you need is support, right? And so for me, that really is the hallmark of what civil society should be doing, is finding young people where they are, looking at the work that they're already doing because those things exist, and saying, as people with resources, as people with perhaps more experience and access to opportunities, how do we support the work that you're doing? And then let young people do it themselves. Because often, I think, especially in civil society, we like to think that we're the ones with all the answers. We like to think that just because you have funding for a particular thing, that you're the authoritative voice on it. And that's just untrue. And if we're going to think meaningfully about youth participation, we need to be able to do it in a way that places young people at the center, to say, actually direct us into what is the work that needs to be done. Tell us what you need from us. And so civil society needs to be more responsive rather than rather than imposing, and really find ways of engaging young people that makes them feel a sense of ownership. Because when you do that, young people are more likely to opt into the things that you're doing. I'm going to stop there because my time is up. I'll talk to you during questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Pearl. And I think what's interesting for me as part of your conversation was around the balancing act that needs to be struck in relation to the types of youth participation that we would like to see versus the ways in which young people actually do participate in, and sort of the system's response to that participation. There's a lot of still trauma from the Fordist movements and the ways in which the system covertly and overtly responded to the nature of those young people's participation. There are youth that we are aware of that still haven't recovered insofar as their mental health and well-being. as a result of coming out to claim their space, as it were, in that institutional and reform conversation. There are youths that are incarcerated for the ways in which they chose to participate in those instances. And so, how do you marry our deeply profound need to want to see young people participate versus the ways in which we sort of expect them to participate, and then how their participation ends up happening? Of course, I would like to remind you again, as part of the delegates, that you are welcome to ask any questions, put down any comments or thoughts in the chat section that we'll try to engage with at a later stage. We'll also be launching a couple of polls throughout the session. We do have our second one that's currently on at the moment, and we encourage you to participate in that poll. The question reads, why do you think young people do not participate in the electoral process? And the options are, is it a sign of apathy and disinterest? Is it a failure of government and civil society to educate about the importance of voting? Or is it simply a vote of no confidence in the system itself that relates to voting? The first poll that we did have, that we'll be discussing also at the end, or rather after Crystal's presentation, was asking us, is there sufficient political will to create inclusive spaces for participation of young people in the policy and economic space? And I think we had 4% rather of people respond saying yes, and 82% of our attendees said no, and 13% had been unsure. And on that basis, I'd like to then call our next speaker, Ms. Crystal Duncan-Williams, who is the project lead for Youth Capital, and she'll be speaking to us in part about the crisis of youth unemployment. And of course, unemployment is bad regardless of demographic, but I think specifically where we sit with young people's unemployment, it's at a crisis level. The role of the National Youth Development Agencies and other agencies, for instance, that Crystal could think about in encouraging youth economic participation, and then capacity building and development of young people, opportunities for innovation are going to be some of the things that she discusses. I did see in the comment section that a comment had been made around this. I think it was Hussein Rasool who was saying, yes, youth participation is one important issue, but what about the other issues that should be put on the table? Youth unemployment rates are horrendous, and they put an exclamation mark of economic empowerment, and hopefully Crystal will be able to give us some insight based on her experience and her work at Youth Capital. Welcome, Crystal.
Thanks so much, and morning to everybody. Yeah, I guess I'm glad that somebody had made that comment, because we can't talk about youth being active citizens in a country when the majority of them do not have a job and have never had a job. We need to eat, okay? At a very basic level, there is the need to provide for yourself and for your family, and the dignity that comes with having an income. And it's impossible for us to talk about youth being active citizens in a country when that very basic need for many young people remains unmet. Pre-COVID, we had over 8 million young people already not in employment, education, or training. And these numbers can roll off the tongue and we can just feel lost in them. But if you think about it, that's filling the F&B stadium over 80 times. And I always use that analogy because just the sheer size of the problem, I think, is something we become numb to when the numbers have been in the millions for the past decade. And even more shocking than that, roughly 60% of these young people have never had a job. And you can imagine what this does to one's self-esteem, to constantly being applying for jobs, to constantly feel rejected, and to be looking for years without any kind of success. And so this is the mental state of young people in this country. And so to expect them to just stand up and find their place in a world that is hostile to them, where they are met with violence, where they are met with closed doors, with tokenistic approaches to youth participation, I think we have to take all of this into account. And so to just I think it's important for me to just give a little bit of context on youth capital and where we come from, because it shapes a lot of what I'm going to say. Youth capital really was envisioned to fulfill this gap of young people being at the center of solutions around youth unemployment. We really believe that the reason why we've struggled to tackle the scale of the problem in any real way is because, one, there isn't a shared agenda for tackling youth unemployment. Every program that's started by government or civil society or an NGO is, has its own mission and its own little target, but how does that feed into the bigger picture? And two, that young people themselves have been left out of the conversation. Things are top down. We have people sitting in government who are 50 and 60 years old. And as Tessa said, just because we were all young once doesn't mean we understand what it's like to be a young person in South Africa in 2021. And how are we equipped at all to design solutions that really meet the needs of young people? And so I think when we look at the youth unemployment crisis, we have to bear all of these things in mind. We have to understand that young people are their lives are more than just finding a job. So it's easy to say, let's just, make entrepreneurs of all of these young people. But have we really thought about the fact that most young people live in households where there aren't any employed adults, that these young people have never been employed themselves? And then we look at agencies like the NYDA, which has actually spent a lot of its time in the past giving money to entrepreneurs or to starting up businesses. But how are these young people, we're setting them up for failure? They have no mentorship, they have no experience, they have no business administration knowledge. And then we expect them to succeed because we in the system have failed them. And now we're turning our back on them and saying that they need to create opportunities for themselves. And this is a completely unacceptable approach. And it's not a surprise to anybody that it hasn't worked. And so, at Youth Capital, we really put forward an action plan for the sector, saying that young people go through journeys of being in places of schooling into a period of transition between places of learning and places of earning, and then entering the world of work. And we need to value that young person's journey through all of those stages. We need to value work that isn't just formal. It isn't clocking in into an office job. Young people are hustling all of the time. And while they're doing all of that hustling, they do care about the politics of the country. They do realize that what decisions that government makes does affect them on a day-to-day basis, but they don't engage with that because the mechanisms that we use for engagement aren't meeting young people where they are. And I think that COVID has been great in the sense that suddenly we have the NYDA, for example, sharing links to a participation or a consultation forum on a policy that's being put forward. And so that's a step in the right direction. But when you have these meetings and young people attend and they post comments and questions in the chat that never get addressed, once again, we're saying that the door is open to young people, but we're not really listening to them. And so I think to go back to Tessa's point about creating space at the table, so not just opening the door, but then creating the space for these young people's voices to really be heard is really, really important. We look at the crisis of youth unemployment and how much worse it's gotten during COVID. But what we need to think about is how young people have adapted in this time. And there's so much opportunity for innovation and to think about mechanisms for how to engage with young people. WhatsApp is the simplest tool. Youth Capital has worked with Youth Lab and with Tessa, around using WhatsApp to just have conversations about policies that are being put forward. And they're simple conversations. They're not complicated to set up. It's a WhatsApp chat. But we're meeting young people where they are. We know that WhatsApp is one platform where almost all young people are. And yes, we must acknowledge that network connectivity, data issues, access to smartphones are barriers to many young people in this country. But WhatsApp is the most broad platform we can use in a COVID setting, in a under-resourced setting, to try to connect with young people. And I really don't understand why we aren't making use of these innovations for political participation in more meaningful ways. Previously you would have road shows where whichever department was putting forward the policy, so for example, Department of Women, Children and Disabilities would have a road show and they'd go province to province. And, I've been to these and you have like 3 young people in the room and the rest of us are all practitioners or NGOs or government people. And so how do young people feel in that space that they can really speak up when they're around all these people who work in the space, and the program's designed that there isn't actually that much space for comment and discussion. And so these old school ways of like having meetings in person, I think COVID's done all of that on its head, and that's great. So how do we use some of that energy, some of this forced innovation, to create spaces where we can really talk to young people? My experience with young people is sometimes if you give them a 100-page policy document, nobody likes reading a 100-page policy document. Let's be honest, it's jargony, it's boring, it's long-winded. And I think how we can support young people to engage with that content is to make it digestible, to put it into formats that young people want to engage with. And I think if we did that more, put out polls on Twitter, which we at Youth Capital all the time, and use social media for putting out little snippets of something, we see young people engage with that extremely actively. But I don't think that people use those innovations enough, and it's nothing complicated. We haven't developed a website or a particularly fancy app, but we've created a way for young people to engage with that. And I think that when young people are struggling to find work and struggling to make ends meet and to provide for their families and complete their studies with all of the challenges that they face and the mental health load that young people carry in this country, if we want young people to participate, then we need to make it as easy as possible for them to do that. And I don't believe we've done that well. And, to jump onto some of Tessa's points, we really send the message that the only time we listen to young people is when there's violence and, like you said, banging down the door and burning of things. That's the time when young people get a response. And so we've told them that's the only way that you can have a voice. And I think we need to change that approach and make these spaces not tokenistic, but real spaces where young people can come to us. So at Youth Capital, what we've done is we've spent a lot of time just talking to young people. And so, our 10-point action plan that we think is an action plan for youth unemployment that, everybody should adopt is not something that, me and my team of 4 have sat and come up with. We've looked at research and evidence, and then we've really spoken to young people. And we at no point in time believe that we have all the answers. It's an iterative process. And I think that that's another thing. Once we figure out a way of engaging with young people, we have to constantly be asking them, is this how you want to be engaged? Is this method of engagement working for you? Do you feel like you can add value? And then be open to criticism. And I think a lot of times government, stakeholders, organizations, entities like the NYDA aren't always open to receiving that criticism and aren't agile enough to adapt and be flexible. And also to understand, as Tessa said at the beginning, that youth are a heterogeneous population. In this given moment in time today, a 15-year-old's experience and a 25-year-old's experience today is vastly different. And to have a one-size-fits-all model for engagement across those age groups is unrealistic. Our methods of engagement, we know in our project work well with the 25-year-old on average age group. And we acknowledge that high school youth we haven't engaged with, but yet they're the ones who are going to be stepping into this 20+ age group in a couple of years' time. And so I think, Tessa's point about starting to engage with the children is really important, and how we move through the journey that young people walk on with them, and understanding these different stages that they face in their journey to being thriving adults. And obviously being part of a thriving adulthood is this economic participation. And I think that we must acknowledge that the formal sector in its current state is never going to create enough jobs for all young people. But what we need to acknowledge is that what skills are we providing young people so that they feel equipped to take up their space in the world? They come out of 12 years of schooling, and let's be honest, what do young people really have to show for it? I think that when we think about, we were talking, the speakers were speaking earlier about democracy, about using this very old school traditional type of democracy. What I thought about then is the schooling system. We have a schooling system that's very little has changed really in the last however many decades when it comes to the schooling system. We are not preparing young people to think critically for themselves, to take up space in the world, to understand and engage with the world. And we are then surprised when we have to have all of these bridging programs, these work readiness programs, to help young people be equipped to step into the world of work. And I think that there's a moment, schools are behind. We're talking about a catch-up strategy. There's discussions about stripping down of the curriculum, because of the losses due to COVID. There's a moment now where we could really look at the curriculum and say, does this really prepare young people for the world in 2021? And I think if we're honest with ourselves, we have to admit that it doesn't. And people will come with technology. We need to do more STEM training. We need to have computers in schools and tablets in schools. But if schools still have pit latrines, if young people can't read and write, if young people can't do basic maths, then all of these fancy technologically 4IR jargon, kind of things aren't going to make any difference. And so I think we need to look at the fundamentals at a school level, which then helps young people be prepared to step into being active citizens, to step into sustainable livelihoods. And we need to tell young people and that the journey that they're on is valued, and that this very linear ladder that we're selling them, this dream of you finish school, you get a matric, you go to university and you get a job, that's not how the world works. And we need to acknowledge that there are other ways for young people to become thriving, sustainable, happy adults in society. So I think, I just want to wrap up with talking about, the role of the NYDA in this. So the NYDA's mandate is very broad, and I acknowledge why it has to be that way, because exactly to my point of young people being heterogeneous, of them living full, diverse worlds that are more than just how they participate in the economy. But I think what the NYDA can do, there's the new national youth policy. They've got a long list of indicators that they want to achieve with the integrated youth development strategy. And our young people said, why don't they just have like a little app where you can like vote? They have a central WhatsApp line where people could submit comments and have those actually taken up and actually listened to by the NYDA would be a huge game changer. There are all these big innovations and millions of money, of rands, going into economic stimulus packages, a lot of which is aimed at young people. But how are we coordinating all of those processes to be more than just a couple of thousand rand in a young person's pocket for a month or 2 or 3 at a time? How are we making these opportunities that are costing the country millions, meaningful opportunities for young people to use this to create a pathway in the world for themselves? And how do we use this opportunity for them to really benefit their communities while they're doing that? And I think we already know the answers, but the problem is we don't coordinate those institutional knowledge very well. We don't coordinate existing stakeholders very well. And I think the NYDA could play a better role doing that. So I know my time is up, so I'm going to wrap up there, even though I have lots more to say.
Thank you very much, Crystal. I'd encourage you to keep your camera on for now, so that we can start a discussion with the other panel members as well. Of course, our last poll has been up, and the current numbers look at why do you think, or rather our second poll was up, and it says, why do you think young people do not participate in the electoral process? 10% of our attendees have responded that it might be a sign of disinterest and apathy, and 10% have said it's a failure of government and civil society to educate about the importance of voting, and 80% says it's a vote of no confidence in the system. So for the purposes of our discussion, there are some comments that we'll go through briefly, but I just want to start, perhaps, I think all of you can get a chance to respond to this, because I think all of your sort of discussions did touch on some of these issues quite significantly, and I'll try and phrase it as broadly as possible. So Tessa, Pearl, and Crystal, all of you are involved in some respects in the sort of policy advocacy space. For Tessa, you've had some core and key work in the National Planning Commission, for instance. And for Pearl, you do research and engage with young people at the ground level, specifically around the national youth policy and what their needs are, and whether the national youth policy itself adequately captures the ambitions of young people in the next sort of space of 5 years. And of course, with Youth Capital, primarily around the economy and employment is your core contribution as part of your work. what are the impediments to actually making some of these things that we see in the policy space a reality, especially when it comes to the youth demographic? I know in this country that we talk a lot about the idea like that we have great policy, poor implementation. The one thing that I sometimes have an issue with in relation to that discussion is that if the policy was good, that good, surely it also has an opportunity to create the right sort of mechanisms for its actualization. So is our policy that good? What are the gaps that we see in that space? And anyone can pop, but I just advise you to just maybe lift your finger up so that we know that who's exactly speaking in that regard. If no one's popping, then I'll just go test the
So what's going wrong with policy, and do we have good policies that is responsive to young people? I don't think we do. I think we're still creating policy in vacuums, and that's part of what the problem is. So we're creating policies based on things we know, based on models from here, there, and everywhere, but missing from our policy making process is true participation. And true participation, particularly of young people, so that they can inform policy with a lot more granularity. And with the National Planning Commission, we did go through a process. We did some work on youth employment, youth labor market transitions, youth in the economy. And one of the things I insisted on was not only that youth workers were at the table, but that the base of that research had to include engaging with young people themselves and saying, young people, help us inform this policy as much as possible. Last week, I was asked by the Department of COCTA to organize what they called the first time they'd ever engaged with young people before starting a policy process. So that tells you just how removed citizens in general and young people in particular are from policy, and therefore the policy doesn't hit the spot. People can't see themselves in government's policies. Where the implementation failures, even when you do have some good policies, I think especially when it comes to young people's lives, we don't have enough youth development practitioners within government, within our society as a whole. We've been talking a lot about the professionalization of youth work in South Africa, and it's really weird to me. On the continent generally, and South Africa in particular, that if you want to go and study youth development, trying to find courses, short courses, long courses, degree courses in youth development is almost non-existent. Yet in other parts of the world, people can be youth development practitioners by trade and by skill, and they're taken seriously. In government, we have what we call youth desks. So the presidency has a youth desk, or at least the ministry in the presidency now has a youth desk. Every department has to have a youth desk. Provinces have to have youth desks. But those people are not necessarily skilled youth development practitioners. And so their ability to translate the Department of Agriculture's latest policy on cooperatives, how do you translate that for young people's needs? That requires a youth development practitioner, not just somebody who's a specialist in agriculture. So I think that's a big gap in our ability to implement, is that we're not investing in the discipline and the practice of youth development. And we're just assuming that if somebody is young, they can do youth development, or we assume that youth development is just something that's going to happen organically and naturally. And we're learning that's not the case, and it's starting to impact on our ability to implement for young people and with them.
Thanks for that input, Tessa. Pearl?
So I wanted to add on to Tessa's point about the way in which policy is made. And I think one of the big issues we have is I don't think that the people who make policy actually are thinking about what policy is meant to do. So I'm going to rant quickly about a thing that I've been ranting about for a long time. And Crystal is already smiling because she knows what I'm going to talk about. We had the National Youth Policy. And last year, was it last year? Time is not a real thing. It might have been the year before. At some point in the last 2 years, that policy lapsed and it was time to do a new one. And what the Department of Women, Children, People with Disabilities, and everyone else who's not men, what they did was they took the previous policy and they copied and pasted it word for word and said, this is the new policy. And I think those of us that work in the youth development space saw that happen, and this was just shockwaves all over, because you could see that, number one, there actually isn't any sense of what is our youth development goals, what do young people need, how are we thinking about what policy is meant to do. And so it feels like policy just becomes then a tick box exercise. Oh, a policy lapsed, we need a new one. Let's just give them the same one, no one's gonna know. Everyone's gonna know, right? And so I agree with Tessa, we don't actually have very good policies, and we don't have excellent implementation at all. But I think part of the issue is just the way we think about policy and the role that policy plays in our society. It's why things like the National Planning Commission is important, right? But the reason why they're not spotlighted and given the kind of resources and support that they need is because we don't take things like planning seriously. And policies are just plans, right? But we don't take it very seriously. We don't see the value that it has and the potential that it has to create a developmental goal for South Africa. And so we end up with really like lackluster policies that don't really come from any great insight or participation. And so we're kind of setting ourselves up for failure, because you can't, even if you implement a bad policy, it's still a bad policy. That's all I just wanted to rant.
We appreciate that rant. And yes, Crystal?
Yeah, so and I'm sure Paul will know what my rant's going to be. I think the problem is we perpetuate the cycle that there is no accountability. So we had the National Youth Policy, and there wasn't even a monitoring and evaluation framework for it until halfway through the period of the policy. And then the policy ended and no reports were ever shown to anybody, and nobody made a big noise about it. So why can't we just copy and paste the old policy? Because nobody even cared what we did about it, right? And so I think, I know that Youth Lab and Youth Capital have been saying we need to keep the pressure going, because what government does is it makes big fanfare that there's a new policy, we welcome comments, and then they put out this massive document, like I've already said, that is jargony, that is difficult for people to engage with, and then you just email something to some email address, and maybe you hear back, and to be fair, they've gotten a bit better with saying thank you for your comments at least, but then you don't hear anything again, and then you get another email saying the policy's been launched, here's the final version, and then half of your comments weren't taken up. And then there's some big event and everybody's happy and they're playing music and we're like, oh, there's a new policy, and then you say, but where's the monitoring and evaluation framework for this policy? No, we're still going to develop it. How can you launch a policy? And as Paul says, it's essentially a plan. How can you launch a plan that has no clear goals, and then expect the public to somehow figure out, public broadly and then youth particularly, figure out how are we supposed to value whether this policy is doing what it said it would do or not when we don't have a monitoring and evaluation framework? So, I am very big on data, and, my big passion in life is saying that research and data sits in these ivory towers of academia. And if, people, like any citizen, just understood the value that data would have if it was in their hands in a way that they could engage with, in a way that they could use it to advocate for themselves and their needs and the needs of the people around them, we could see a very different model of participation in this country. But we like to keep it in jargony places and in academic literature, where unless you're in that space, you're not going to come across it. And so I think we need to make a common practice to say, here's a dashboard. You click a thing on the government's website. This is what they said they were going to do. We're 1 year into the policy. Have they done it? And government's really bad at doing that. And I think the role for civil society is to put the pressure on more strongly and to create space for young people to join us in putting on that pressure and saying, we need these M&E frameworks, because otherwise we just keep perpetuating this lackluster checkbox exercise of creating a policy for the creative space for the sake of creating it, without it actually ever materializing into any real action that has any value in the lives of the people it's supposed to be helping.
Thank you so much, Crystal. I think the real concern around the absence of an M&E framework in relation to the youth policy and a large number of policies, we have a Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation, in my view, I don't know, doesn't do enough work, doesn't feel like they know exactly what they need to be doing. But of course, then we'll have to engage on that further. And I think someone alluded to, it was Pearl, alluding to the ministry of everyone but men. Why is it there? Is it doing anything for any of those constituencies that it's meant to be serving? To the extent that when we are invited to meetings as young people, do we actually engage in a real way, or is it just another tick box exercise as is mainstreaming that happens from government side when they feel like there's something that's happening, we need to do it quickly, and then they knock it off and they say, as someone had said earlier, again, we have 30 young people in the room, so therefore they were represented. Before we move on to the next segment of our discussion, I just want to quickly have Tessa respond to a question that's directed to her around the sort of a curriculum for youth workers. What are some of the factors that you need to take into account when developing such a thing?
Yeah, so one of them is an understanding of what youth is. So we speak a lot about youth as a period of transition as opposed to youth as an age cohort and all of that. But it's part of a broader understanding that youth means different things in different contexts. That helps us understand that when we're developing programming for young people, we can't just be generic, we can't just be broad, we need to be specific and cater for young people's needs. And so curriculum would teach more about the concept of youth, what youth means, what it looks like, and how you start to address those things. Another thing is the question about what the developmental pathway of youth development is and of young people's lives are. So, for instance, in psychology, you learn about life stage approaches to things. I think a youth development curriculum would benefit a lot from people understanding the life stage approach, so that if youth is a transition from childhood to adulthood, then we need a beginning point of that, the exit from childhood, and we need an end point to that, the entry into adulthood. In South Africa, if you ask people, do you believe that you are a South African adult that is contributing to the society and you have achieved adulthood? It's very hard for people to say what that would actually look like and mean, because we haven't defined it as a society. So when you say you're bringing young people into adulthood, but you don't even have a definition of what a South African adult who's successfully living their lives is, how do you then determine what youth development's goal is? So something like that would be important. Certainly issues around how do you make meaningful participation work, that would be part of a module I would create almost immediately, because you need to think about what are some of the power dynamics that young people are dealing with. They're dealing with questions of age, they're dealing with cultural dynamics. I know in the South African context, people ask me constantly when they hear that I've been in the National Planning Commission, how did I deal with the fact that I was young in a room of old people? And how do you, when you're speaking to a president or you're speaking to a minister, how do you hold them accountable, give them advice as a young person? And we need to learn about those things. How do we overcome some of those cultural nuances and barriers so that I can be respected as a young person and give my opinion and hold a president accountable, while being respectful of the fact that African culture does have those power differentials in it and as a part of it. So those are some of the things. And then also how to do programming. Programming is one of the huge issues that is lacking. Project management skills, the ability just to hold conversations, hold meetings, some basic organizational skills. And Brian, you would know, having run DDP, how you're working with so many young people who are doing great things in their communities, but they can never apply for a grant because they don't have the basic skills on how to run an organization, how to write a proposal, how to do project management. And so they end up doing amazing work by themselves, but it can't be seen by the system because they don't know how to formalize that. And then, and in addition to that, the question of advocacy. And so one of the things I've kind of developed a little mini curriculum around is the difference between activism and advocacy, and how you utilize those two things differently in different circumstances so that you have more results and impact. So those are the kinds of things I would say would be on my short list for a youth development module.
Thank you so much, Tessa, for that feedback in terms of that question. Of course, the other speakers can input as they contribute to the latter part of the discussion as well. And so on this segment of the discussion, I'd like to talk about meaningful youth engagement. We did all touch on it in terms of our different presentations. But perhaps we'll start with you, Pearl, and what's your view around this, specifically as you had talked about the system's response to the way in which young people choose to participate. And then there's always that sentiment about, especially for us who are both young but also work in the space of youth development, that meaningful youth development is the emphasis that we ought to try and carry when we talk about youth participation. And a comment from the chat section says, the way we ignore and ill-treat our youth is a ticking time bomb. The rate of unemployment is too high. We must not be surprised if crime, deviance, social disorder, and defiance increase dramatically. Government seems to respond only with violence and destruction. What is your view, and perhaps with some insight on the nature of that sort of pervading trauma that as a result of Fees Must Fall and the way the system responded, of what we need to do going forward in order to encourage and engage meaningfully with young people?
Sure. I mean, by all means, don't make it easy on me. So I think what I'm doing in my PhD research is actually trying to understand that question, is what does our conception of citizenship and our place in this country look like and feel like when every time there's some kind of citizen action, we're met with violence and brutality, right? And so what does that mean for our ability to interact with democracy, for our ability to participate in ways that we would like to do, right? If I talk about my own personal experience, the kind of trauma that was created during Fees Must Fall, especially that day at the Union buildings, has meant that I am less inclined to want to go to a protest or want to participate in a social movement that requires me to be outside, right? But I come from I have a long history of interacting with social movements in a very kind of active way, right? And there's a lot of young people just like me who find themselves in that space where used to be kind of very politically active, very politically engaged, out there on the streets doing the things, but the constant, not just threat of violence, because it's always there, right? We have a very difficult relationship with police in this country, because it is one of the most brutal police forces in the world, right? And so there's always the threat of violence. The presence of police alone just gives you the sense that things can pop off at any time, right? And what does that mean when that threat actually then becomes a guarantee, right? You know for a fact that if there is a protest of any kind of scale, you're going to get police, you're going to get tear gas, you're going to get water cannons, you're going to get all the things, right? What does that mean for your ability to participate? And we've been saying that young people in this country are a ticking time bomb for at least, I've been at Youth Lab for 7 years. And when I came into the space, we were already saying that. I don't think we're a ticking time bomb anymore. I think the bomb's exploding. And it's manifesting in ways where young people are simply just opting out. We're saying we're not going to turn up to elections. We're not going to join political parties. We're not going to go and protest and create social movements that deal with the problems. We're just not going to participate in the ways you would like us to. And those things spill out, and we see it in different ways. I mean, we've had, even through lockdown, right? We've had community protests. We've had different social movements that have been created to deal with just the added issues that the pandemic and lockdown brought. But the ways young people choose to engage is changing, and we can't sit and say, this unemployment crisis that we have, the safety crisis that we have, the health crisis, the corruption crisis, we sit in a bowl full of different bombs, right? And they're all kind of going off, and young people are saying, there's no way out for us. And that's where apathy sets in, right? Because I think we've been saying this for a really long time, that young people are actually not apathetic. They really do care about their communities and well-being and progress and all of those things. But when you're constantly faced not just with violence, but a leadership that is so brazen about how little they care. We're just seeing this week, that an entire health ministry is looting funds during an actual pandemic, right? And it's like this weird kind of dystopia that you're just like, we knew that it could happen, but it's like, really, this really happened. Like, this is a real thing that's happening to us like right now. And the more those things happen, the more people throw their hands up and say, what are we supposed to do? And that's where your sense of apathy sets in. And so what needs to be done, because we're in a public platform, I can't say the things that I want to say, but I think we need to have a very serious conversation about leadership and what leadership means for us as young people. We have elections coming up, and it's a really good time, I think, to engage with what our place is in this country. I think the move towards allowing independent candidates to contest, we're in a really important moment where we're reimagining what our electoral system looks like. And I think that that's kind of where things begin, is to reimagine what democracy must look like for young people today, and how we interact with that democracy and how we make it work for us. But beyond that, I'm just not sure. I think, excuse me, sorry. I think it's really difficult to imagine a solution when the people that should be part of the solution are so hostile towards it, right? And so we can sit and think our way out of everything, right? We can solve all the world's problems together. But if you go to the state and you go to our political leaders and they say parliament is not a creche, what are you supposed to do, right? So I think it's really difficult, but I think that there's an onus on the older generation and on current political leadership, those that do believe that young people have a place in this country, to just do more and help create the space for things to actually happen.
Thank you very much, Pa, for those inputs. Parliament might not be a creche, but it does certainly seem to be an old age home. So, Crystal, on the subject of existing policy and mechanisms that are meant to be engaging young people, what's your assessment of the Youth Employment Service?
Oh, again, public platform. I think it's interesting. So we've been talking to Yes quite a bit. We actually had one of their staff on a panel with us last week talking about experience. This conundrum that young people face of needing to have experience but never getting a job to get any. And I find it so interesting that Yes had all these various models that they were going to run, and the one that's been most successful, and maybe it's not surprising at all actually, is the model where a corporate says, here's some money, okay, implementing partner, go place these young people in social economy work somewhere, right? And so what does that say to you? Corporates want to tick a checkbox, they want to get the tax incentive benefits, but they don't actually want to invest the work that is needed in growing the next generation, right? And I think this kind of private sector capitalism approach, is not going to serve anybody. And I do think we kind of badmouth employers quite a lot. And so I don't want it to come off as being somebody who says it's all on the employer side. They just don't want to hire young people. They have real concerns with hiring young people. But I think what we need to acknowledge is what I said earlier, that young people are stepping out of schooling without the necessary skills to step into a place of work. And that's a failure of the schooling system. And so then I think when you have programs like Yes, they need to acknowledge that and work with employers to accept that this young person needs a mentor when they enter the workplace. You can't just get the tax write-off and check a box that you have a young person there. When you haven't set up anybody to support that young person, that person's never been in a job before. Maybe they're spending 2 hours to get to work every day because they're taking public transport. And actually the cost of the public transport is like 2/3 of their salary. So they're just going to drop out of the program. We see young people where they get recruited into these positions like Yes or any of these other, kind of intermediary roles. But without that support in the workplace, they feel like when they have to go home to the Eastern Cape for a funeral, they don't know how to ask for that leave. When they can't make ends meet because transport is actually so expensive that they just don't come back. And then employers say, well, young people are unreliable and I invested training in this person and after 6 months, they just didn't come back. And so I think programs like YES could do a better job of communicating with employers and getting employers again, because we have employers that have a solution, or we have a top-down tax break to try to get big corporates to hire young people. But at a granular level, which we've kept saying, how does it really acknowledge what it's like to be that young person in that job that you've funded or stipended? And we spend so much time looking at the young person and focusing on the demand side and the work readiness and connecting them and helping them write a CV and maybe giving them money to get to the interview or whatever it is. But then what work have we done with employers? And so I think YES could do more of that, and other intermediaries could do more of that work, because I think that's what's lacking. Employers, who are you going to be hiring 20 years from now if you aren't preparing the current people stepping out of places of work, and if you aren't grooming them? We all need work experience. You can't. Who's going to be your manager? Who's going to be your management team 20 years from now if you don't start grooming them? Who are going to be your consumers 20 years from now if they've never had an income to spend in the economy? And I think we don't think about that broader picture enough. And I think that the fact that YES is using that model because that's been the most successful, I think is problematic, because you're letting corporates and people with the money opt out of doing the difficult work. And we need to create more engagement to have them do the work of actually understanding what it's like to be a young person. And all of these tax breaks and BBBE is really currently geared to make it easy for big corporates to leverage that, and SMMEs are left in the dark because they're a small entity, they don't have HR systems, it's complex, there's way too much red tape. So again, organizations like YES could make that process easier and work with SMMEs, I think, better, because there's thousands of SMMEs in this country. If each one of them just employed one young person, it could be a game changer. So how do we make that happen a bit better? And I think these are some of the things that you should be thinking about.
Thank you so much for attempting to hold your tongue in some of in relation to some of those things. It's such a difficult conversation, the idea of like succession planning, especially when you look at civil society, for instance. I'm very encouraged by the spaces that are opening up, such as Youth Lab and Youth Capital and so forth, that are like making sure that as part of their work and inside their own organizations, there are actual young people represented, and not just because it's in the name of the organization or in what the organization is meant to be doing. Because a couple of years ago, we were having this youth indaba, and I'm just like, but guys, clearly what's at stake for people to actually consider grooming, mentorship, and succession planning around young people is not necessarily about the absence of ability or the inability of young people to actually take up those positions, but it's about an insecurity from the older generation about how they will continue to be relevant in the space. And of course, we are led by trailblazers like or Tessa, who left when they decided to go, I am no longer part of this category of people, and I'll leave someone who is in that space. But of course, Tessa, as you engage and respond, and maybe talk a bit to us about what is at stake for both in the political space, but also just in general in civil society, for people who are thinking about youth development, but are not necessarily thinking about making that youth development personal, because that was a personal decision that you had to take for yourself, for instance, to make sure that the goal of youth development is lived out through some of the action that you all have.
Sure. So for those of you who didn't catch what Brian was saying, I used to lead the organization that Pearl now leads, Youth Lab. And when I turned 35, actually before I turned 35, I said to the team, guys, my time here is up. This is not that kind of party where we just like overstay our welcome. I'm out. And I didn't have a plan. I didn't know where I was going to next. That was not the point. The point was that Youth Lab, by its premise, was a youth-led organization when it was originated. And I believed that young people needed to lead that space. And so I was going to lead it. But it also was triggered by a conversation that I had on radio once with an unknown person who I'll never know who he was, because He didn't bother to introduce himself. But he described himself as an older man who had fought in the liberation struggle and was now in like political circles and business. And he said, this thing that young people think that it's their turn to be at the table is nonsense, because when we were in the struggle, our youth was taken away from us. Our youth was stripped away from us. And so we are going to eat your youth because our youth was taken. And that really triggered me, because I said to myself, I don't want to be that kind of old person. I don't want to be the kind of old person that says, because I was not given spaces at the table, I was not given the things, all of that, I'm now going to make the next generation pay for that. There has to be a generation that decides to be sacrificial, that decides that we are going to sacrifice our opportunity to lead, our opportunity to have the things, to have the success for the next generation to be able to emerge. There has to be a catch-up program. And you'll see it now within political parties, particularly within the ANC, where because that liberation generation has decided that every one of them in the queue must first lead before another generation can come in, you have a missing middle in the ANC of people between the ages of about 40 to 60 who are just nowhere in the organization, who've been there for years and years and years and are still being treated like a Fikile Mbalula is being treated like he's still a kid, like he still represents the youths. But his whole generation is not actually being treated with the kind of seriousness, and you only say 2 or 3 people in that age category actually emerging anywhere. And that's because there's not a sacrificial sense in which we see the value of having young people lead our society, lead organizations. And so we hold on and we hog the space. I always say that in Africa, if you look at our political history, the same people who led liberation, they were young when they led it. They were in their 20s and their 30s when they were leading liberation. And it was their zeal, it was their innovation, it was their vibrance, it was their new ideas that made their ability to lead liberation successful. The same people now are saying the thing that will make leadership successful is experience. So they've completely shifted the goalpost from zeal and passion and new ideas to experience because it suits them. And so I'm not saying this to young people. I'm saying this to old people like me and older. I'm saying that we must stop shifting the goalposts to suit ourselves and using our financial abilities, our power relations, our networks to keep young people out. And we must recognize that bringing young people in the door brings something with it that we don't have. And the last way I'll think about this is, I was speaking to the mayor of Germany a few years ago. And he was saying to me, much in the vein of a YES program and the kind of entrepreneurship programs we have and youth employment programs, that their big corporates bring in young people into their organizations. They will create space for them, give them office space, incubate their businesses. They will bring them in, into they think about it as kind of building your own timber. So they'll bring in pipelines of young people into their workforces and they'll pay for their studies. And so my first question to him was, so what's the incentive? What incentives does government provide to, get these corporates on board? He said, what do you mean incentives? There was a translator in the room, guys. He kept asking the translator, what does she mean by incentives? The translator was like, is there a different word here? I said, no, isn't the government giving incentives to these people to do this? And he said, the incentive is that company is getting fresh, young eyes, vigor, talent. It's getting new innovations. It's getting from young people what young people bring to the table. It is getting a better business because it has invested in youth. It does not need government to subsidize it. And so I'm going to rant about the YES kind of programs just a little bit to add to what Crystal was saying, by saying that what we have done in this country in the last 5 to 10 years is create a youth unemployment industry. We've created an industry of people who are making loads of money off the back of putting young people through programs where they don't get sustainable employment and where they go from program to program, and where their success as programs is based on how many young people are unemployed rather than employed. And that is something we need to systemically, absolutely change. If we're going to change this country and we're going to think about this country differently, we must think about an investment in young people as our reward for what we do, and not think of young people as something we can make money off. I'm less diplomatic than Crystal.
No, we appreciate that energy as well. I think let's try and bring it to a close. I know there are some huge frustrations with sort of webinars, with dialogues and so forth. People come into the space thinking, okay, I'm coming to dialogue. Hopefully this engagement will be different from the last one, because hopefully I'll get some timelines, I'll get some quick fix-it list of things that we will take away and start doing better, and implement and action and all of that. But of course, we do understand that there's value in conversation as well, just in terms of bringing the ideas and the different thought patterns into the fore. So no pressure to round off in that way. But if you do have some insights around some of those subject matters, as both Anna, and I think it was Phil Makutle on the comment section, we're thinking around what do we need to do then to move forward on all of the subject matter that we've been talking about? What are some of the things that can be done? How do we bring about a change? I know we've implicitly and of course overtly said some of the things in relation to some direct inputs that we were talking about earlier, but as a way of summarizing the discussion around youth participation in both the economy and in politics, what are some of your key directives, whether it be to departments or to organizations or to people, as Tessa had just laid the gauntlet to older people? It's always a difficult one when you're talking about the generation preceding the one that's youth, because you don't want to offend people calling them old. But it's one of those things. So I'll start with you, Crystal, and then we'll have Pearl, and then we'll end off with Tessa.
Sure. So I think, I've touched on some of these things already. So for us at Youth Capital, if you're a young person and you want to engage with the stuff, but you have no idea where to start, reach out to us. Our website is youthcapital.co.za. Click the WhatsApp link, ask for the link to be added to the working policy group, which we run together with Youth Lab. And we try to use that as a space for engagement. And again, we at Youth Capital are no way thinking that we have all the answers. So if you have an idea about how we can pull together young people into a WhatsApp broadcast list or some kind of dashboard where young people can start holding government accountable, we are all ears. We're trying to figure out how do we make this national youth policy different from all the previous ones by holding government accountable year on year and not forgetting about it until it's up for renewal 10 years from now. So we are figuring that out, and we welcome you to join us on that journey, whether you are a young person or somebody working in the space who maybe has a great idea. So I think that's a very real way we can engage with it. And then again, to use this moment of COVID, we are getting these Microsoft Teams invites to all these government meetings. So it's a step in the right direction. Before, if you couldn't travel to the meeting and get on a plane and get there wherever the meeting is, you'd be excluded. Now you just need an internet connection. So, how do we start using those spaces in a real way as young people, as civil society, to force government to think about youth participation differently? I think there is a moment, and so how do we use that together? Again, I'm not sure that I have the answers, but I do think we need to work together to make the best of this current situation. And then lastly, Youth Capital, we're running a series called Be the Driving Force, and young people, this is all about digital activism, so we're covering a really big range of topics, and you can follow us on social media for that, really getting space for young people. So the Instagram lives, there are young people who are doing the work across issues of the basic income grant, climate change, second chance matric programs, a range of things that we're speaking about, and so we really welcome you to listen to young people, to hear what these young people have to say that are leading these spaces around these really big social issues, and for you to see that young people are active. Maybe you're just not looking in the right places. So I think that's it from me in a nutshell.
Thank you so much, Crystal, and thank you for joining us today. And we really appreciate your contribution as well as Youth Capital's representation in spaces such of this nature. Paul, your thoughts?
So for me, besides everything that Crystal's already said, I think one of the main things is actually just get involved, right? So if you are an organization, a lot of what we do, we say this all the time, but it really is a crisis that so many great organizations don't know that we all exist. And collaboration, I think we've seen it in the last year or so with our marriage with Youth Capital, is there is so much strength and potential in just finding organizations that share the same values as you and just finding ways to work together. And a lot of the time it's, conversations with Crystal and myself or Crystal's team and mine about, okay, what are the things we need to do? And how do we do this together, right? And so collaboration for me is what grounds any kind of progress that we're going to make, especially in the youth development space, because one of the things that is used against us often is that young people are in competition with each other, organizations are in competition with each other, and that kind of fragmentation is what makes it easier to kind of dribble all of us, right? And so that's kind of a message to civil society is let's actually work together. Let's actually find people that are speaking the same language as us and figure out ways to move all of our work forward. For other young people who want to do something, and I know that like you were saying, Brian, is the kind of online, especially now with COVID, right? All of these online seminars and all of that is kind of exhausting and makes you feel like you're doing a lot without actually doing anything. But there is work to be done, and there are people that are really invested in doing the work. And so if you are a young person and you have something to contribute, one of the things at Youth Lab that we'd often say is you tell us what you would like to do. Tell us how you would like to contribute, and we'll figure out a way to make it happen. And so it really is about putting your hand up and reaching out across the table to organizations that you think not necessarily represent you, but can give you space to do the things that you want to do and actually, get some work done. I think a lot of our organizing and a lot of the work that we do is happening outside of government. And I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing. And, the push towards accountability, towards getting ourselves in government spaces, like Crystal mentioned, going through things like the NYDA, participating in processes like the National Youth Policy are all important. But I think what we've seen in the last many, many years is that the real work actually happens outside that system. And so there has to be a push for all of us to be able to figure out and define what youth development is going to mean and where we find ourselves in it, and what are the things that needs to be done. And government will either be on board or they won't, but either way, we need to actually just get work done. And so, reach out to organizations that speak your language and do things. Thank you so much for having me. This was fun.
Thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed yourself, Pearl. It's always good to connect with the youth organizations. Tessa, your final contribution?
Yeah. So what do we do? Number one is put your hand up. If you're a young person, if there are opportunities that come around, put your hand up. Back yourself. Remember that you bring more to the table than your age. You have experiences, you have thoughts, you have views, you have feelings, and often we undermine what young people think, and the young people undermine themselves because they've bought into the narrative that they are the recipients, that they are the beneficiaries of things. And I want young people to see themselves as contributors. Always see yourself as a contributor. Just remembering that your personal experience as a young person is something that minister, that policymaker does not know, does not have. So even if you just share your experience, you're giving them something unique and valuable that they need. The second thing is partner with each other. And I think Crystal and Pearl have spoken to this a bit in terms of young people partnering with each other. But I want to say to people who are thinking about how to engage with youth development, to government, to NGOs, to the private sector, partner with young people. The backbone of this country is community workers, most of them youth, who are littered across the length and breadth of this country, who every day are waking up and in informal ways making their communities work. Find those young people and partner with them. Get the resources in their hands, build their capacity, give them access to the platforms that you have, partner with them and help them make the things that they're doing more successful. And then the final thing I'm going to say is pay. Pay young people. Pay young people. First problem we have in this country is we don't want to pay young people. And who do we need to pay? All of those volunteers I just spoke about now, who are in those communities every day, who are the ones that the mamas trust, who are the ones who can get you the hall for free, who are the ones who can do all the things that they need to do in their communities and are trusted and all of that. We need to stop using this idea of volunteerism as some altruistic thing. And we need to start paying young people for every bit of value they add to our society. Every time a young person shows up and gives value, they should be paid. And that, especially in the NGO space, we have neglected to pay people because we think we're doing them a service. When actually in the NGO sector particularly, it's that young person coming to your event that allows you to get your next grant. Pay young people for everything that they add to the system. We can solve the unemployment crisis in this country if we stop focusing on giving young people the job and paying young people for what they actually do bring to the table.
That's exactly it. I think that's a really exciting note to end on, considering I'm still young too, and I need to get paid. So thank you so much, Tessa, Pearl, and Crystal for your contributions. Thank you to the Mail and Guardian for their willingness to partner with us on this discussion. And I think, given the background that Pearl, Tessa, and Crystal know about this specific engagement, I think we exceeded expectations. I'm giving myself a pat on the back. No, I kid, but thank you so much for your participation, and thank you to the guests that did attend. Of course, for those that you may know who are interested in participating, this will be available on the Mail and Guardian YouTube page, so it is accessible and will be live thereafter. We'll also be publishing a short report that will have the link of the engagement shortly as well with the Mail and Guardian. And we really do think that the mandate of meaningful youth engagement rests with all of us, regardless of how old or young we are. And the spaces that youth you have access to, certainly you need to ensure that you enable the access of others as well into that space, particularly young people. And yeah, thank you so much, and have a good afternoon henceforth. We look forward to seeing you in our future engagements, and I hope to be invited into some of the youth spaces. I did post a comment on the comment box. We have a youth Indaba that we're hosting for the 5th consecutive year, happening on the 10th of June, and we'd like for anyone who would be interested in joining us online to access that link that I did post on the Zoom page. Of course, if you do require more information about the DDP, our website is under the offers tab of the specific engagement. And we do thank you on behalf of the Executive Director, Dr. Paul Kariuki, the Cotton Adenauer Foundation, and our colleagues from different organizations who have joined us. We do appreciate your participation. Thank you and goodbye.